You pick up a kitchen knife. It feels ordinary, sharp enough, heavy enough, nothing special. You assume modern steel is simply the best steel there has ever been. Centuries of engineering, precise furnaces, controlled everything. Surely nothing from 1,000 years ago could compete. The real answer is far stranger. Because for a few hundred years in medieval Europe, there existed a sword so far ahead of its time that when researchers finally understood what it was made of, some of them didn't believe their own results. Its name was stamped right into the blade. 2 words, inlaid in iron wire, running down the fuller, the shallow groove that runs along the length of the steel. Vlfberht. Picture a Viking Age trading post. Cold, grey, longships pulled up on a muddy riverbank. Most swords of the era are serviceable, functional, made from folded, layered iron with pattern welding twisting the metal back on itself, again and again, to hide impurities. Because the raw material of the time simply isn't consistent enough to trust on its own. Then there's the Ulfberht. You'd notice it in a pile of ordinary blades before you even picked it up. Something about the proportions looks wrong, almost too refined for its era. Lighter in the hand, more flexible without bending permanently, able to hold a sharp edge in combat without shattering the way lesser blades did. To the smiths and warriors standing next to it, it must have looked less like a weapon and more like a small miracle, something that shouldn't exist yet, existing anyway. For a long time, historians assumed the name was simply a maker's mark, a brand, a signature, nothing more mysterious than that. But as more of these blades turned up in riverbeds, in graves, in museum collections across Europe, researchers noticed something odd. There wasn't one Ulfberht. There were dozens, spanning roughly 2 centuries, and their quality varied wildly. Some were genuinely exceptional. Others were clumsy fakes, imitations with the name spelled wrong, the letters crowded together or reversed, clearly copied by someone who couldn't actually read what they were stamping. Why would anyone fake a brand that didn't guarantee quality? Sort the fakes by quality, and a pattern starts to appear. The best of the imitations are still decent swords, just not exceptional ones, made by smiths who understood roughly what they were copying, even if they couldn't replicate the material. The worst are barely swords at all, ordinary iron with the name scratched on as an afterthought, sold to buyers who probably never got close enough to a genuine Ulfberht to know the difference. Somewhere in the middle sit blades that are almost right, close enough to suggest their makers had seen the real thing up close, maybe even handled one, before trying to recreate it with worse materials. The answer says something important about what the name actually represented, and it took modern science to work that out. Metallurgist Alan Williams spent years cutting into surviving Ulfberht blades, literally, taking thin cross-sections and analysing their carbon content under a microscope. This is not something you do casually to a 1,000-year-old artefact. Museums don't hand over priceless swords for destructive testing without a very good reason, but the results justified it. What Williams found in the genuine examples was remarkable. Carbon levels around 3 times higher than typical medieval iron, and distributed with a consistency that European smiths of the time had no reliable way to achieve using the bloomery furnaces available to them. Here's why that consistency matters so much. Iron smelted the ordinary medieval way comes out as a spongy, impure mass called a bloom, full of slag and unevenly distributed carbon. Smiths would fold and hammer it repeatedly, sometimes dozens of times, to work out impurities and even out the carbon as best they could. It's skilled, exhausting work, and it still produces steel with pockets of weakness. This wasn't that. This was crucible steel. Metal melted at temperatures so high and cooled so slowly and evenly inside a sealed clay vessel that the carbon dissolves uniformly through the entire structure. No folding needed to fix it because there was nothing uneven left to fix. Modern steelmaking wouldn't reliably master this kind of controlled, high-temperature, uniform melt in Europe again until the Industrial Revolution. Roughly 800 years after the last genuine Ulfberht was likely forged. So where was a Viking Age smith getting furnace technology that European metalworking wouldn't rediscover for centuries? They weren't. That's the twist. The raw steel almost certainly wasn't made in Europe at all. The best archaeological and metallurgical evidence points toward a source thousands of kilometers away, arriving through trade networks that ran down through Russian river systems, connecting Scandinavia to the Islamic world and beyond, into regions where crucible steel production, sometimes called Wootz steel, had been refined for centuries by that point. Arms historian Ian Pearce, who examined dozens of surviving Ulfberht blades firsthand over the course of his research, argued that the ingredients had to be imported because nothing in the local European supply chain of the time could plausibly produce steel this clean. A 2016 isotopic study led by researcher Robert Lehman pushed the picture further still, using trace element and slag inclusion analysis on Ulfberht blades to try narrowing down where the raw metal itself might have originated. It added hard chemistry to what had, until then, been mostly educated guesswork built on sword quality and trade route logic. This kind of analysis is slow, careful, and destructive in small ways every time. A sliver of an artifact that took a smith weeks to forge gets sacrificed, so a lab can read what's locked inside its structure. Researchers weigh that trade-off constantly, and for the Ulfberht blades, institutions eventually decided the historical payoff was worth the sacrifice. Every fragment removed for testing added one more data point to a puzzle that had sat unsolved for the better part of 1,000 years, ever since the last smith who understood the secret died without writing it down. Not every question got answered. Researchers still debate exactly which mines, which routes, which middlemen carried the ore on its final leg into Europe. What isn't in serious doubt anymore is that the material itself had to come from outside the continent. European ore deposits of the period simply don't produce iron this clean without help. Think about the logistics of that for a second. Raw ingots of high-purity steel, produced somewhere near Central Asia or the Middle East, moving north over land, and then by river, along trade routes controlled largely by Rus traders and Volga Bulgars, changing hands multiple times, eventually reaching a workshop somewhere in the Rhineland region of what is now Germany. That single ingot might pass through the hands of a Central Asian miner, a Baghdad merchant, a Volga trading post, and a Scandinavian middleman before it ever meets a hammer. Every one of those exchanges required trust between people who likely never met face to face, speaking different languages, following different customs, bound together only by the shared understanding that this particular grey lump of metal was worth carrying thousands of kilometers. There, a smith who understood the material's rare quality forged it, folded it as little as possible to preserve its purity, and stamped a name into the blade to mark it as something different from everything else on the rack. That name wasn't decoration. It functioned closer to a certification mark. A promise that the steel inside had come from somewhere far away, had been made a specific, superior way, and cost accordingly. And that's exactly why it got faked. If you're a smith working in a market where an Ulfberht sword commands a premium price because everyone recognizes the name means something, of course you're tempted to stamp the letters onto ordinary local iron and sell it as the real thing. It's the medieval equivalent of a counterfeit label sewn into a cheap jacket. The fakes aren't a footnote to this story. If anything, they're proof the brand actually worked. Nobody bothers forging a name nobody trusts. Here's the part that should sit with you a little longer than the rest. For a long time, popular imagination treated the Viking Age as a story about raiding, longships, and brute strength. Crude weapons for a crude world, swung by people who valued ferocity over craftsmanship. Popular culture, films, television, even some older textbooks leaned into that image because it's simpler to tell and easier to sell than the reality underneath it. The Ulfberht blades complicate that picture completely. They reveal a trade network sophisticated enough to move specialty materials across thousands of kilometers through multiple cultures and languages without the materials degrading or the supply drying up for 2 centuries. They reveal a market sophisticated enough to develop brand recognition and, inevitably, brand counterfeiting. And they reveal metallurgical standards that European industry as a whole wouldn't match again until furnace technology caught up nearly a millennium later. The people wielding these swords weren't just warriors swinging sharpened metal. They were, whether they thought of themselves this way or not, participants in a specialty supply chain most of us never learned existed in school, and the quality gap wasn't small. Later, medieval and even early modern European blades, made centuries after the last genuine Ulfberht, often still fell short of that same carbon consistency because the underlying furnace technology hadn't caught up yet. An entire continent kept making weapons the old, imperfect way, while the memory of something better sat buried in the ground beneath them, unread and unexplained, waiting for a microscope that wouldn't exist for another 800 years. So go back to that kitchen knife sitting in your hand. You assume it represents the accumulated peak of human metalworking, an unbroken line of steady improvement stretching back through history in a straight, upward line. More recent always means better. That's the quiet assumption underneath almost everything you own. But somewhere in a Rhineland workshop over 1,000 years ago, a smith held a piece of steel so far beyond what the rest of Europe could produce that it took modern microscopes, modern chemistry, and centuries of catching up before anyone could even begin to explain how it was made. For a few hundred years, the best steel on the continent had already come and gone, buried in graves and riverbeds, waiting. Progress isn't always a straight line. Sometimes the best version of something exists first, gets lost, and has to wait 800 years for the rest of the world to notice it was ever there at all. The next time you assume newer automatically means better, remember the blade buried in the ground, quietly proving otherwise the whole time.